In 1792, William Tuke, a Quaker tea merchant from York, witnessed something that would reshape his understanding of madness forever. His fellow Quaker, Hannah Mills, had died under mysterious circumstances at the York Asylum. When Tuke attempted to visit her during her confinement, he was repeatedly denied access. The secrecy surrounding her death sparked a revolution that would momentarily illuminate the darkest corners of Britain's treatment of the mentally ill. Tuke established the York Retreat in 1796, introducing what he termed moral treatment, a radical departure from the chains, cells, and brutality that defined existing institutions. At the retreat, patients walked freely through gardens, ate meals with attendants, and were addressed with dignity. The patient should be treated as much in the manner of a rational being as the state of his mind will possibly allow. Tuke wrote in his revolutionary manifesto, the death rate at York Retreat plummeted to less than half that of traditional asylums. The influence of this humane approach spread rapidly across Britain. John Conley, visiting the retreat in 1830, observed patients sitting quietly in the parlor, some reading, others working, without a single chain or restraint visible. This vision of therapeutic possibility stood in stark contrast to the reality festering in institutions like Bethlehem Royal Hospital, where visitors could purchase tickets for twopence to observe the madhouse as entertainment. Yet, even as moral treatment gained philosophical ground, the practical realities of Britain's expanding asylum system were already undermining its principles. The 1774 Madhouse Act, Britain's first attempt at regulation, proved woefully inadequate. Licensed madhouse keepers required only minimum oversight, and private operators discovered that confinement could be extraordinarily profitable. Dr. Thomas Monro, physician at Bethlehem from 1792 to 1815, testified before Parliament that he knew of no cure for insanity and saw his role merely as containment. Patients are ordered to be bled and vomited the next day, whether they would or not, he stated matter-of-factly. The gap between moral treatments, ideals, and institutional reality widened with each passing year. While Tuke's retreat housed fewer than 30 patients in comfortable surroundings, the demand for asylum beds was exploding. Across industrial Britain, county magistrates faced with growing numbers of poorer lunatics sought the cheapest possible solutions. The stage was set for a system that would prioritize custody over cure, profit over compassion. Bethlehem and the machinery of madness. Bethlehem Royal Hospital stood as the most notorious symbol of Britain's treatment of madness. By 1815, the hospital had moved to new premises in St. George's Fields, Southwark, where its imposing facade masked horrors that would shock even hardened Victorian sensibilities. Edward Wakefield, a land surveyor who gained access to Bethlehem in 1814, discovered conditions that defied comprehension. In the women's gallery, Wakefield found patients chained by one arm or leg to the wall, some sitting on straw, others on the stone floor. One woman had been chained in the same position for 8 years. The male patients occupied cells about 8 ft square with no bedding except straw that was generally some years old and never changed. The stench was overwhelming. Windows remained sealed shut year-round, and patients received no change of clothing for months. James Norris, a former American Marine confined at Bethlehem, became the symbol of institutional cruelty. For over 12 years, he remained locked in an iron harness that circled his neck and body, chained to a wall in a cell barely 6 feet long. The apparatus prevented him from lying down or standing upright. When parliamentary commissioners discovered Norris in 1815, his body had become so contorted by the restraint that removal required careful surgical intervention. "I am not an animal," Norris told his liberators, his voice barely audible after years of enforced silence. The practice of madhouse tourism reached its peak during this period. For twopence on Sundays, Visitors could tour Bethlehem's galleries, observing patients as entertainment. Annual attendance exceeded 96,000 people by 1,814, making Bethlehem one of London's most popular attractions. Patients were provoked with sticks and taunted to perform for the crowds. The cries, imprecations, and obscene ravings of the maniacs provided amusement for London society, one contemporary observer noted with disgust. Dr. John Haslam, Bethlehem's chief medical officer from 1795 to 1816, embodied the institution's callous approach. When questioned about treatment methods, Haslam declared that chains and straw were the fit and proper treatment for the insane. He regularly exhibited patients to medical students using a whip to demonstrate their conditions. His detailed case notes reveal a man utterly devoid of therapeutic ambition, viewing patients as specimens rather than human beings requiring care. The 1815 parliamentary inquiry that exposed Bethlehem's conditions sent shock waves through British society. Yet the reforms that followed proved largely cosmetic. The hospital's governors dismissed Haslam and the steward, installed better ventilation, and banned public tours. But the fundamental approach remained unchanged. Patients continued to be chained, cells remained overcrowded, and treatment consisted primarily of purging, bleeding, and cold baths. The machinery of madness had merely become more discreet in its operations. The expansion of county asylums and legislative failures. The County Asylums Act of 1845 represented Parliament's most ambitious attempt to address the crisis in mental health care. The legislation mandated that every county in England and Wales construct and maintain a public asylum funded by local rates and subject to inspection by newly appointed commissioners in lunacy. The act promised reform, standardized care, and an end to the worst abuses of private madhouses. Instead, it created the infrastructure for abuse on an unprecedented scale. Within a decade of the act's passage, the asylum population had doubled. Counties rushed to construct massive institutions, prioritizing capacity over quality. The Surrey County Asylum at Brookwood opened in 1867, housed over 2,000 patients in a single complex stretching nearly half a mile. These Victorian monuments to institutional care became warehouses for society's unwanted, the poor, the troublesome, the inconvenient. Dr. John Bucknell, the first commissioner in lunacy, initially embraced the expansion with optimism. We have witnessed the erection of asylums on a scale of magnificence and completeness unknown before, he wrote in 1847. Yet within years, his reports grew increasingly troubled. Overcrowding had become endemic. Staffing ratios fell below minimum standards. The therapeutic environment promised by the legislation had given way to custodial warehousing. The case of Louisa Lowe exemplified the system's capacity for wrongful confinement. In 1870, her husband committed her to Brislington House Asylum near Bristol after she expressed interest in women's rights and questioned his religious views. I was told I was mad because I would not say that 2 and 2 made 5, Lowe testified. Despite her obvious sanity, she remained confined for 18 months. Her eventual release came only through persistent legal challenges that bankrupted her family. The commissioners in lunacy, designed as guardians of patient welfare, proved inadequate to their task. With fewer than a dozen inspectors responsible for hundreds of institutions across England and Wales, meaningful oversight became impossible. Annual visits lasted mere hours, often announced in advance, allowing asylum keepers to conceal their worst practices. Commissioner reports from the 1850s read like catalogues of persistent failures: inadequate food, insufficient heating, overcrowded dormitories, and rampant disease. Private madhouses continued operating alongside the new county asylums, often with even less oversight. Dr. Southern Thurland Ree Phillips operated Fish Ponds Asylum near Bristol as a profitable enterprise, charging families substantial fees while providing minimal care. When inspectors visited in 1859, they found patients sleeping on straw in unheated cells, subsisting on bread and jorrel. The establishment appears to be conducted more with a view to profit than to the welfare of patients, the commissioners concluded. Yet Ree Phillips retained his license and continued operations for another decade. The legislative framework created by the 1845 Act had established the infrastructure for systematic abuse while providing inadequate mechanisms for prevention or correction. The promise of moral treatment had been bureaucratized into a system of moral abandonment, the exploitation of patients and industrial-scale abuse. By mid-century, Victorian asylums had evolved into complex economic enterprises that exploited patient labor while maintaining the facade of therapeutic activity. The transformation from places of healing to sites of industrial production occurred gradually, justified through the rhetoric of moral treatment and occupational therapy. In practice, asylums became dependent on unpaid patient labor to maintain their operations and generate profit for their operators. At Hanwell Asylum in Middlesex, patients worked 14-hour days in the institution's laundry, producing linens for London hospitals and hotels. Women scrubbed, pressed, and folded in steaming rooms where temperatures regularly exceeded 90 degrees F. The asylum's annual report for 1863 proudly noted that patient labor had generated profits of €2,847, equivalent to over €300,000 today. Superintendent Dr. John Connolly, celebrated as a reformer eliminating mechanical restraints, had simply replaced chains with economic bondage. The agricultural work at county asylums proved even more exploitative. Male patients at the Devon County Asylum cultivated over 200 acres of farmland, producing vegetables, grain, and livestock that supplied the institution and generated substantial revenue. Work began at dawn and continued until dusk regardless of weather conditions. Patients who refused to work faced punishment through dietary restrictions, solitary confinement, or transfer to more restrictive wards. The patients are made to understand that idleness will not be tolerated, recorded the asylum's chief attendant in 1868. Women patients faced particular exploitation through gendered labor expectations beyond laundry work. They performed all domestic duties within asylums, cooking, cleaning, mending, and caring for fellow patients. At Colony Hatch, the massive Middlesex asylum that opened in 1851, over 800 female patients provided unpaid domestic labor that would have required hiring hundreds of servants. Asylum's medical superintendent, Dr. William Ree Williams, calculated that patient labor saved the institution over €30,000 annually in wages. The workshop system at major asylums resembled industrial factories more than medical facilities. At Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, patients operated machinery producing shoes, furniture, and textiles for sale to government departments. The noise from workshops was deafening, safety conditions were appalling, and injuries were commonplace. In 1874, a parliamentary inquiry found that Broadmoor patients worked longer hours under worse conditions than factory workers with no compensation beyond basic subsistence. Private asylum operators discovered that patient labor could generate extraordinary profits. Dr. Francis Willis Jr., who inherited his father's prestigious private madhouses, employed patients as agricultural laborers on his Lenger estates. Wealthy families paid substantial fees for their relatives' confinement. unaware that these same relatives were working as unpaid farmhands, generating additional income for Willis. When exposed in 1877, Willis defended the practice as therapeutic. Useful employment prevents mind from dwelling on morbid fancies. The pseudoscientific theories of the era provided intellectual justification for exploitation. Phrenologists argued that manual labor could reshape the criminal or diseased brain through repetitive activity. Dr. Henry Maudsley, one of Britain's leading psychiatrists, proclaimed that work is the natural medicine of the mind diseased. Such theories conveniently aligned with economic incentives, allowing asylum operators to present exploitation as medical treatment. The scale of patient exploitation reached its zenith in the 1870s as asylum populations peaked. Conservative estimates suggest that unpaid patient labor saved Victorian asylums over 500 annually, money that should have been spent on medical care, improved nutrition, and therapeutic programming. Instead, profits flowed to shareholders, landowners, and government coffers, while patients remained trapped in a web that viewed them primarily as economic resources to be extracted rather than human beings deserving of dignity and care. The final descent, eugenic thinking. As the Victorian era drew to its close, the asylum system had abandoned even the pretense of therapeutic intent. The rise of eugenic thinking in the 1880s transformed mental illness from a medical condition requiring treatment into a hereditary threat requiring permanent isolation from society. This ideological shift provided scientific legitimacy for the most brutal period in the history of British mental health care. Dr. Henry Maudsley, whose influence dominated late Victorian psychiatry, declared in 1886 that the insane are a degenerate class and their offspring will be degenerate also. This pronouncement, accepted widely in medical circles, fundamentally altered the purpose of asylums. No longer institutions of healing, they became repositories for genetic undesirables who threatened the purity of the British race. Treatment became not only unnecessary but counterproductive. Curing the mentally ill would only allow them to reproduce and spread their tainted heredity. The impact of eugenic ideology manifested most clearly in the treatment of women. Female patients diagnosed with moral insanity, a catch-all category that included everything from sexual impropriety to political activism, faced sterilization procedures disguised as therapeutic interventions. Patient records reveal that many of these women had been committed for behaviors such as refusing arranged marriages, expressing feminist views, or bearing children outside wedlock. Experimental treatments reached new levels of cruelty during this period. The water cure at Bethlehem involved strapping patients to chairs and directing high-pressure water at their heads for hours. Dr. Percy Smith, who administered these treatments, believed that the shock would reorganize the disordered brain. Patients frequently lost consciousness. Several died from the procedure. Smith's detailed notes describe the treatments with scientific detachment. Subject became insensible after 47 minutes of continuous application, revived with stimulants, and returned to ward. The practice of sensory deprivation, introduced at several major asylums in the 1890s, involved confining patients in completely dark, soundproof cells for weeks or months. At the Lancashire County Asylum, Dr. James Stewart confined over 200 patients in these dark cells between 1892 and 1898. Stewart's justification drew on contemporary brain research. The overstimulated nervous system requires complete rest to achieve healing. Patient testimonies recorded years later by reformers described the psychological torture of prolonged isolation. I began to hear voices that were not there to see faces in the darkness. I begged them to let me die. The notorious Utica crib, imported from American asylums, appeared in British institutions during the 1890s. These coffin-like wooden boxes just large enough to contain a human body were used to restrain violent patients for days or weeks. Patients could neither sit up nor fully extend their limbs, and the boxes were often placed in basement cells without light or ventilation. The commissioners in lunacy investigating complaints about the devices in 1897 found patients who had developed permanent deformities from prolonged confinement. The death rates at major asylums climbed steadily through the 1890s, reaching levels that would have scandalized earlier generations of reformers. At Broadmoor, annual mortality exceeded 20% by 1895, with tuberculosis, malnutrition, and suicide claiming hundreds of lives. The medical superintendent, Dr. David Nicholson, attributed the deaths to the inherent degeneracy of the patient population rather than examining institutional conditions. Richard Dadd's paintings created during his confinement at Broadmoor provide haunting visual testimony to asylum life during this period. His masterpiece, The Fairy Fellow's Master Stroke, painted obsessively over 9 years, captures the claustrophobic intensity of institutional existence. The intricate detail and hidden symbols reflect a brilliant mind trapped within a system designed to destroy rather than heal. As Queen Victoria's reign ended in 1901, Britain's asylums housed over 100 patients in conditions that violated every principle of human dignity. The moral treatment movement that had begun with such promise a century earlier had been corrupted into a mechanism of social control and economic exploitation. The Victorian legacy in mental health care was not the humanitarian progress celebrated in official histories, but a cautionary tale of how medical authority, scientific prejudice, and economic interest could combine to create systematic cruelty on an industrial scale. The patients who survived this system carried scars that no amount of later reform could fully heal.